sees a holiday that the world looks at as being of religious origin as an opportunity to do things that they wouldn't do any other time of the year. Overeating, I should have left that one out, shouldn't I? Some people will drink this time of the year, won't do it any other season. Overspend, just overindulge, and yet the rest of the year seem to live at least fairly disciplined lives. I don't even know why I told you that. This is a very joyful season of the year, and I do understand the why on that. It comes from the words of Jesus himself, as quoted by Paul. There's more joy in giving than in receiving, Acts chapter 20 and verse 35. I tell you what, this season of the year when we do a lot of giving, I'm not surprised at all to see it be the happiest time of the year for most people. God just set it up that way. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it shall be opened. Or what man is there among you, when his son asks him for a loaf, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a snake? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children. Having grandchildren has brought back the memories of when our daughters were young. As we've stood in aisles and looked at what seems like an endless display of toys and games that we just have to try to figure out which one would they like the most. Had to be placed under some restrictions by our children. They've had to tell us, look, from now on, just 3 gifts for Christmas, that's all. You can't get them more than that. We would inundate them if we could. It's too hard to decide. We want to give one of everything. If you then know how to give good gifts, I've thought about that. And I'm going to suggest to you today that there are 3 or 4 very good gifts that you can give your children. And I want to start by suggesting to you that you need to give your children a good name. That's valuable. You know, God has an interest in names. I just discovered that as I was reading recently in Genesis chapter 5. And he created them male and female, and he called their name Adam. God named the first man and woman, called their name. I guess he gave them the names Adam and Eve, Adam. But he had a real interest in naming them. You get on over to Genesis 17. Here is a man of great faith named Abram. But God said, that's not a good name, exalted Father. I'm going to change it to Abraham, father of a multitude. His wife, Sarai, he said, no, she needs to be named Princess Sarah. Even when his own son is coming into the world, he's had the prophet sort of blaze the trail by saying things like, his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And specifically stated in Isaiah chapter 7 that a virgin will be with child and she'll give birth, shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. That is, God with us, carried out in Matthew chapter 1. God has an interest in names. He has an interest in good names. Solomon, his counsel is beyond brilliant. You remember he made the statement in Proverbs 22, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. My grandfather was a gospel preacher well known in his day and age, and especially in his part of the country back many years ago, named Gus Nichols. That's where the Nick in my name comes from. He left his family a good name. That's what I want to leave my children, a good name. And I recognize it's so easy to mess that up. Just one careless moment, and they're ashamed to have to tell people what their name is. Not their fault. Some names absolutely ruin. Nobody names their daughter Jezebel. Nobody names a son Judas. There is not much more that you can do to bless your children than by giving them a good name. You mess it up, they will pay that price all their life. Give them the blessing of a good name. Second, give them a Christian home. And I can't emphasize that strongly enough. And I am not talking about a home where we show up for church on Sunday morning if everybody's feeling well and if it's not raining and if there isn't something more significant that we think we ought to be doing. I'm talking about a home built around a holy God, where mom and dad are seeking to emulate the character of Christ. I'm talking about a home where there is a dad who is deeply devoted to God. I love the words of Paul, Ephesians chapter 6. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but the old King James says, bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. I'm thankful for a transition that I've seen in our society. Men today, young men, take an active, hands-on role in the nurturing of their children. You know, when I grew up, my dad was from that generation where the husband didn't change the diaper. He didn't help with bath time. He brought home the living and he was the stern disciplinarian, but that pretty much was his role. I'm thankful today to see a generation of younger men who are actively involved in the lives of their children. They hold them, they hug them, they kiss them. They're in there building them emotionally. They're connecting with them, and that's a marvelous thing. Don't let it stop with those. Nurture them spiritually. Be open in talking with them about God and the impact that He's had on your life. Role model to them what it means to live a life of faith. Let them see it in you. Most of us that are my age, we think back at our fathers. We know what it was like to be a hard worker. We understood the value of a dollar. They placed that within us. Go beyond that. Help them to see the role of God in your heart. Guys, I got to tell you, there is no feeling on earth like knowing you led your own child to Jesus Christ. My work at Pleasant Valley requires that I spend quite a number of hours every week, seems like, counseling with couples who are having difficulties. My heart goes out to Christian women today, especially young Christian mothers. They are under a tremendous amount of pressure in our society. Pressure to remove God and family from the role that God designed it to be. They're under pressure to keep up, to maintain the style, the appearance. They're under a lot of pressure to find self-fulfillment. If there's anything that a mom needs to do, it's to see the value of being a Christian mother. They have a huge role in kind of gauging the direction of their children. Paul didn't have anybody on the face of this earth that he could count on like he could count on Timothy. And you stop and think about it, it wasn't that he trained Timothy. He didn't. He writes in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and talks about Timothy's faith that dwelt first in his grandmother Lois and then in his mother Eunice. And Paul says, and I'm persuaded in you also. Never mentions a male role model. Just the godliness of these two women that had equipped Timothy to be the one person that he could most use in this massive role of taking the gospel to the Gentile world. He almost had that one by himself. There were 12 men that were fixated on the much, much smaller population of Jews, but this whole world of Gentiles out there, Paul had it dumped on him, and when he needed help, he found a man who had role modeled for him by his grandmother and mother that life of devoted service. And he even tells him in 2 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 14, to continue in the things that he has heard and learned, knowing of whom he has learned them, and that from a child he knew the Holy Scriptures that made him wise unto salvation. Long before Paul showed up on the scene, Timothy as a child was getting trained by his mother and his grandmother. You want to give your child a good gift, Mom? You can do it. You can spend that time instilling within that child the great love of God. And I would suggest to you a third thing you can give your children is discipline. You know, God sets the pattern for that. Whom the Lord loves, he scourges and disciplines every son he receives. Hebrews chapter 12. He's the perfect father. He's our role model. We need to give our children discipline. Let me tell you why I'm bringing this up. It hasn't been that long. Kathy and I had several young families in our home. Most of them did really well, but there was this one couple that they had children they had brought to like the others. I'm not sure from the time they walked in our front door if they ever knew where their kids were. I seriously doubt they had any idea what they were doing. I mean, it was like when they walked in, they're not our responsibility right now. Somebody else needs to take over until we leave, then we'll reassume our role. Don't remember a single occasion when that family ever said, did anything that would even remotely fit the idea of disciplining a child. Not a time. The others did. They didn't. The others had to discipline their children too. Not the way it ought to be. Children need discipline. There's a statement that Solomon made just 6 statements after the one, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. He says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. Children need that kind of training. The word discipline is like disciple. It literally means to learn. It's teaching a child something to discipline them. Discipline isn't a parent being angry at Junior for having messed with the alarm clock. Now Dad's late for work. I can remember as a child growing up, my dad grabbing a belt when I would do something and saying, I'll teach you. Teaching, learning, discipline, they're all the same. If there's no learning in it, there isn't any discipline in it. It's just an expression of anger. The whole concept of discipline is to instill within a child that taste for what is right that ought to be done. In fact, even this term that is translated in the Hebrew, train up a child, carries with it that concept. Interesting term to me. Came from midwives who would assist in the delivery of a little baby. When that baby was born and they would clean it up, clean out its mouth, they would take their finger and dip it in honey and massage the gums of that newborn child, creating a taste sensation. Then they could place that child up to the mother's bosom and the child would want to nurse, to feed. They had trained them. They had created a taste for something. That's the concept of discipline. It's to help our children to have that longing for, that taste for God, for righteousness, for what's good. So I would suggest you give your child the gift of discipline. And then fourth, give them the gift of their own faith. That's a long process. Quite honestly, I will tell you that when I was a child, attending church 3 times a week, my dad was also a preacher. Never knew what it was like not to go to church. Never know what it was like not to have heard of Christ, of God. But when I look back to my childhood years, I wasn't in church and I wasn't doing what I did because of my faith. It was my parents' faith. They had enough wisdom to tell me when I was getting close to graduating from high school, you know, you can go anywhere you want to college as long as it's Oklahoma Christian. I sat under some wonderful Bible scholars, learned a lot, and those transitional years heavily influenced, and I wonder how much of it was me, how much of it was their faith. It's been a long time. But I'm not standing here in front of you this morning because of my parents' faith. I'm not here speaking because of my professor's faith. Through the process, I have come to be a believer. And knowing me as well as I do, I honestly can't tell you that that would have happened had it not been for some wonderful influences. People who took the time, who had the love, the care for me, to bless me in helping me to develop my faith. So I think what I want to do is just read to you a thing or two that God said to the children of Israel about this very matter. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your sons. Talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. And you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. You shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. And you shall teach them to your sons, talking of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gate, so that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land which the Lord God swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens remain above the earth. Kind of put that in one sentence in Joel chapter 1, verse 3. Tell your children these things, and tell your children to tell their children, and their children after them another generation. What's he doing? He's helping us so that we can pass our faith to our children, but that ultimately it becomes their faith. That's what you want to give to your children. Because see what we've learned watching ours grow up and now have their own? All those things we stood in the aisle and we tried to figure out which ones we're going to get. They've long since been tossed, put in a garage sale, given to somebody else. Most of them, they don't remember. Hey, most of them, we don't even remember. But there's some lasting things, important things you really can give your children. What are your plans for this season? Put God at the front of them. You need Him. You need the help of the church here to enable you to accomplish that. Then why don't you come to the front and we'll try to help you. Let's stand and sing.